Thanksgiving was supposed to be about gratitude, about warmth, about family coming together under one roof, pretending, at least for one night, that love outweighed everything else. I didn't know my life would begin to split in two while I sat at the far end of a long, crowded table, my hands folded neatly in my lap, my smile carefully practiced. The house smelled like roasted turkey and sweet apple pie. Candles flickered against gold-trimmed leaves scattered across the table. Glasses clinked. Laughter rose and fell in comfortable waves. To anyone watching, it looked like a picture-perfect holiday. To anyone except me. Across from me, my husband Cameron leaned back in his chair, wine glass loose in his hand, laughing a little too loudly with his friend Harriet. She was seated close enough that her knee brushed his when she laughed, close enough that I noticed even though I told myself not to. Then Cameron raised his glass. "There's nothing to be thankful for in bed," he called out, voice clear, sharp, deliberate. The room froze. For half a second, no one moved, no one breathed. Then Harriet nearly spilled her wine laughing, loud, unrestrained, the kind of laughter that demanded attention, that fed on humiliation. Heat rushed to my face. My fingers tightened around the stem of my glass so hard I felt the pressure bite into my skin. Adam, Cameron's brother, cleared his throat awkwardly, eyes darting away. A few people forced thin smiles, unsure whether it was safe to laugh. The silence that followed was heavier than shouting would have been. Cameron smirked. He was enjoying this. I had learned to live with his little barbs over the years, those jokes he loved making at my expense, especially when there was an audience. Normally, I swallowed them, smiled, let them pass. I told myself it wasn't worth starting a scene. But this time was different. This wasn't private. This wasn't careless. This was intentional. Every pair of eyes at that table flicked toward me, waiting, watching, measuring my reaction. I lowered my glass slowly, my jaw tight, my heartbeat pounding in my ears. I forced a small smile, the polite kind, the one I'd perfected over years of avoiding conflict. But inside, something cracked. Cameron expected me to laugh it off, to play my role, to stay quiet. I didn't. I met his eyes and held his gaze. His grin faltered, just for a moment. And in that silence, with candlelight flickering and laughter hanging awkwardly in the air, I made a decision that would change everything. I wasn't letting this pass. Not tonight. Before that Thanksgiving night, before the laughter turned sharp in public, I would have told anyone who asked that my marriage was fine. Not perfect, not cinematic, but stable. I was 36 years old, worked a steady job that paid the bills, and lived in a house that looked good from the outside. Cameron and I had been married long enough that people stopped asking how we met and started assuming we were permanent. We met the ordinary way, through mutual friends, at a small get-together where the music was too loud and the conversation too shallow. Cameron had been charming then, confident, quick with jokes that made people lean in. I noticed how easily others gravitated toward him, how comfortable he was being the center of attention. He noticed me because I didn't fight for it. "You're quiet," he'd said that night, smiling like it was an observation, not a criticism. "I listen," I'd replied. He liked that answer. In the beginning, his confidence felt like safety, like direction. He made decisions quickly. He spoke with certainty. When we disagreed, he framed it as humor, light teasing, playful sarcasm. I mistook that for wit. The first few years were easy. We traveled when we could, hosted dinners, laughed with friends. Cameron loved being admired. I loved making things run smoothly behind the scenes. I told myself that balance was healthy. The jokes started small. A comment about how I took too long to get ready. A laugh about how I overthought things. Little remarks delivered with a grin, always followed by, "I'm kidding." And I let them slide. Because they weren't cruel. Not yet. Because he never raised his voice, never hit walls or slammed doors. Compared to the dramatic marriages I'd seen growing up, ours felt calm, manageable. But slowly, almost invisibly, the jokes became habits. And the habits became patterns. At dinners with friends, Cameron would interrupt me mid-sentence, finishing my thoughts for me, incorrectly. When I corrected him, he'd laugh and say, "See? She's always got to be right." People laughed. I smiled. When Harriet entered our lives, his friend from years back, it got worse. She laughed at everything he said, fed off his energy, encouraged the digs. "Oh, don't mind her," Cameron would say, waving a hand when I fell quiet. "She's sensitive." I hated that word. Sensitive. It followed me everywhere after that. If I spoke up, I was sensitive. If I stayed quiet, I was moody. If I tried to explain how something made me feel, I was overthinking. And so I learned not to explain. Cameron's family noticed, I think. At least Adam did. There were moments when his brother would glance at me after a joke landed a little too hard, his expression unreadable, but no one ever said anything. Because it was easier not to. Holidays became performances. I learned where to sit, when to smile, how to laugh at myself before anyone else could do it for me. I told myself this was what long marriages look like. Compromise. Thick skin. I told myself love wasn't supposed to feel warm all the time. What I didn't realize then was how much of myself I was shrinking to keep the peace. How often I swallowed words before they reached my tongue. How carefully I managed my reactions so Cameron wouldn't accuse me of making things awkward. By the time Thanksgiving came around that year, I had already been fading for a long time. I just didn't know it yet. Looking back, the signs had been everywhere. I just didn't want to see them. After years of marriage, you learn to recognize patterns. Who someone becomes when they're tired, when they're stressed, when they feel powerful. Cameron's favorite version of himself appeared when there was an audience. That was when the jokes sharpened. At first, they still sounded harmless to anyone listening from the outside. A comment about how I couldn't make decisions without a list. A laugh about how I preferred staying in while he still had energy for life. Each time, the room would chuckle politely. Each time, I felt something tighten in my chest. Harriet was always there for those moments. She laughed loudest, leaned closest, repeated his jokes as if they were brilliant observations instead of small, steady cuts. "You two are hilarious," she'd say, clinking her glass against his. I learned to watch her more than I wanted to. The way she touched his arm when she laughed. The way she looked at him, waiting for approval. The way Cameron seemed taller when she was around. None of it crossed a line. Not technically. But the air shifted every time she entered the room. At home, Cameron barely noticed me pulling away. Or maybe he noticed and didn't care. Conversations turned one-sided. He spoke. I listened. When I disagreed, he'd smirk and say, "Here we go." I stopped disagreeing. There were nights I lay awake beside him, staring at the ceiling, listening to his steady breathing while my mind replayed moments I'd brushed off during the day. A joke here, a sigh there. A look exchanged with Harriet that lingered a second too long. I told myself I was imagining it, that I was being sensitive. That word again. Adam tried once, just once, to say something. We were in the kitchen after a family dinner, rinsing plates while Cameron was outside on the phone. "He can be careless," Adam said quietly, not meeting my eyes. I nodded, forcing a smile. He doesn't mean anything by it. Adam didn't look convinced, but he let it go. Everyone always did. The tension built slowly, like pressure behind glass. Cameron's comments grew bolder when I didn't react. When I stopped pushing back, he pushed harder. "You're quiet tonight," he'd say in front of friends. "Everything okay?" The way he asked made it sound like concern. The way he smiled made it feel like a challenge. I started noticing how often he spoke for me, how often he corrected me, how often he dismissed me with a laugh when I tried to explain something important. And still I stayed. Because leaving felt dramatic. Because staying felt familiar. Because I had convinced myself that this was just what marriage looked like after the honeymoon phase ended. By the time Thanksgiving arrived, I was already tired in a way sleep couldn't fix. Worn down by 1,000 small moments I'd never allowed myself to count as damage. So when Cameron raised his glass and humiliated me in front of everyone, it wasn't just one joke that landed. It was every joke that came before it. Every time I'd swallowed my hurt. Every time I'd told myself it didn't matter. Every time I'd chosen peace over self-respect. That night didn't create the fracture. It revealed it. The rest of Thanksgiving dinner passed in a blur. Plates were passed. Wine was poured. Someone talked about football. Someone else complained about traffic. I nodded when expected, smiled when required, laughed softly at the right moments. From the outside, I was still playing my role. Inside, I was unraveling. Cameron acted as if nothing had happened. He leaned back in his chair, relaxed, confident, basking in the energy of the table. Harriet stayed close, whispering comments into his ear that made him grin. Every now and then, he glanced at me, not with concern, but with curiosity, as if he were waiting for me to crack. I didn't. I barely touched my food. The turkey tasted dry. The pie sat heavy on my plate, untouched. My appetite had disappeared, replaced by a tight knot beneath my ribs. When guests finally began to leave, I stood near the door, thanking them for coming. Harriet hugged Cameron a little too long, laughing about how fun the night had been. Adam paused when he reached me, his hand lingering briefly on my shoulder. "You okay?" he asked quietly. I smiled. "I'm fine." He didn't look convinced, but he left anyway. When the house finally fell silent, the warmth drained out of it. The candles burned low, wax pooling on the table. The hum of the dishwasher filled the space between us. Cameron stretched, clearly pleased with himself. "That went well," he said. "Harriet was on fire tonight." I didn't respond. I carried plates into the kitchen, my movements slow, deliberate. I focused on stacking dishes, on not letting my hands shake. Cameron followed, humming to himself as he wiped down the counter like the night had been flawless. That was when I felt it, the moment where something in me refused to bend anymore. I set a plate down harder than I meant to. The sharp clatter echoed through the kitchen. Cameron looked up. "You okay?" I turned to face him, resting my hands on the counter to steady myself. My voice was calm, but it took effort. "Do you realize what you said tonight?" He frowned. "What are you talking about?" "At dinner," I said. "That comment about having nothing to be thankful for in bed." He rolled his eyes and laughed lightly. "Oh my God, it was a joke." There it was. The dismissal. In front of everyone, I was the punchline. Alone with him, I was too sensitive. "A joke," I repeated quietly. "In front of my family, your friends." He sighed, already bored. "You're blowing this way out of proportion." Something in my chest burned. "You do this a lot," I said. "Do what?" he snapped. "Turn me into the joke." "Seriously?" he scoffed. "People laughed. Relax." I met his eyes. It mattered to me. For a split second, he hesitated, not because he understood, but because he hadn't expected me to push back. Then his expression hardened. "You're being dramatic." That word again. I nodded slowly, more to myself than to him. I could see it clearly now, the way he was already reshaping the story, making me the problem, making my hurt inconvenient. I didn't argue, I didn't raise my voice. I turned back to the sink. That was when I knew. Not in anger, not in rage, but in certainty. I was done explaining myself to someone who had never listened. As I walked upstairs, his voice followed me. "Don't do that thing where you shut down." I didn't stop. When I closed the bedroom door behind me, the house felt different, heavier, quieter. And for the first time in years, I felt something else too. Control. I didn't sleep much that night. Cameron fell asleep almost instantly, his breathing deep and even, like nothing had shifted at all. I lay beside him, staring at the ceiling, counting the faint cracks in the plaster, listening to the house settle around us. Every time I closed my eyes, his voice replayed in my head. "It was just a joke. You're being dramatic." The words pressed against my chest, heavy and familiar, but for the first time, they didn't make me doubt myself. They made me tired. At 5:12 a.m., I gave up on sleep. The house was still dark, quiet in that way only early morning can be. Cameron was turned away from me, one arm flung carelessly across his pillow. I slipped out of bed without turning on the light, pulled on sweatpants and an old hoodie, and stood for a moment in the doorway. Normally, mornings were routine: coffee, phone, scroll, prepare myself to exist another day without taking up too much space. Not today. I grabbed my keys and stepped outside. The cold bit into my skin, sharp and clean. The street was empty, porch lights glowing faintly in the distance. For the first time in years, I felt like I was moving with purpose. 15 minutes later, I pulled into the parking lot of a 24-hour gym I hadn't visited in years. The neon sign buzzed softly in the pre-dawn quiet. I used to come here all the time, back when I recognized myself. Inside, the air smelled like rubber mats and disinfectant. A few early risers moved silently between machines. No one looked twice at me. At the front desk, a young guy barely glanced up from his phone. "Member?" "I used to be," I said. Minutes later, I was holding a fresh membership card. It felt ridiculous how much that mattered. I started slow on the treadmill, my legs stiff, lungs burning as the belt hummed beneath my feet. Each step reminded me how long it had been since I'd chosen something for myself. After that, I moved to the weights. My muscles shook. The effort was real, honest. With every rep, I felt something loosening inside me. Years of silence, swallowed words, self-doubt bleeding out through sweat. Halfway through my workout, a familiar voice cut through the noise. "Mark," then it stopped. Troy corrected himself quickly. "Sorry, didn't realize it was you." I turned, surprised, and saw him standing near the benches. We'd worked together years ago. He looked the same, focused, grounded, disciplined. "I didn't know you still came here," he said. "I don't," I replied. "Not until today." He studied me for a moment, then nodded. "Good." We talked between sets. About work, life, not much else. He didn't pry, and I didn't explain. He didn't need details to see something had shifted. "You look like you're waking up," he said. I smiled, breathless. "Feels like it." By the time I left, my muscles ached in the best way. The sun was rising, painting the sky in soft gold. I drove home with the windows cracked, letting the cold air keep me present. Cameron was still asleep when I returned. I showered, dressed, and poured myself coffee. When he finally wandered into the kitchen, rubbing his eyes, he stopped short. "You're up early," he said. "Yeah." He noticed my gym bag, the quiet confidence in my posture. "Did you go somewhere?" I met his gaze. I did. He waited for an explanation. I didn't give him one. For the first time, I wasn't reacting. I was choosing. The change didn't announce itself. It showed up quietly, in the spaces where Cameron used to dominate the rhythm of our days and suddenly couldn't. At work, I felt lighter, not because my life had magically improved, but because I had stopped bracing myself for his voice in my head. My muscles still burned from the gym, a dull ache that reminded me I was doing something, choosing something, every morning before the world asked anything of me. A coworker leaned against my desk one afternoon, squinting at me. "You look different," he said. "Different how?" "Awake," he replied, like someone who finally remembered they have a life outside their marriage. I smiled because it was true. At home, Cameron noticed everything. He noticed when I came home later than usual, never late enough to be suspicious, just late enough to unsettle him. He noticed when I stopped texting updates, stopped explaining my schedule, stopped orbiting his moods. "Where were you?" he asked one night, leaning against the kitchen counter, trying to sound casual. "Out," I said, setting my bag down. "With who?" "People from the gym." He hated that answer. Not because he cared about my safety, but because I hadn't asked permission. The first argument came a week later. He poured himself a glass of wine and waited until I was seated before speaking, his tone carefully neutral. "You've been different." I looked up. "Have I?" "It's sudden," he said. "You barely talk to me anymore." I considered that. Maybe it's not sudden. Maybe you just didn't notice before. That caught him off guard. "What's that supposed to mean?" "It means," I said evenly, "that you didn't care when I was quiet, as long as I stayed convenient." His jaw tightened. "That's not fair." "Isn't it?" I asked. "You've spent years turning me into the punchline. You just didn't think I'd ever stop laughing." He scoffed, but I could see the frustration creeping in. "You're rewriting things now." "No," I said. "I'm finally saying them out loud." That night, he accused me of pulling away, of shutting him out, of acting like I was better than him. I asked him a simple question. "If I had said what you said at Thanksgiving about you, how would you have reacted?" He opened his mouth, then closed it. Silence answered for him. Over the next few weeks, he tried everything. He cooked my favorite meals, lit candles, acted normal, too normal, as if affection could erase years of dismissal, as if timing alone could fix what respect should have protected. I watched him try, and I felt nothing. Not anger, not triumph, just distance. One evening, when I grabbed my gym bag, he stood in the doorway. "Where are you going?" "Out," I said again. He reached for my arm, stopping just short of touching me. "You're not just going to walk away like this." I met his eyes. "Watch me." I spent that night on a friend's couch, staring at a ceiling I didn't recognize, feeling something settle into place. I wasn't reacting anymore. I was moving forward. When I came home the next day, Cameron was waiting at the kitchen table, wine untouched, his confidence cracked for the first time in our marriage. We talked, not loudly, not dramatically. Honestly. I told him what I saw when I looked at him now, a man who had enjoyed belittling his wife in public, a man who only noticed the damage once control slipped through his fingers. He had no defense, only silence. And that silence told me everything. The house felt different after that conversation. Quieter, colder, like the walls themselves were holding their breath. Cameron stopped joking, stopped pushing, stopped pretending everything was fine. He moved through the rooms carefully now, like someone afraid of triggering an alarm he didn't understand. For years, I'd been the one adjusting my steps, my tone, my words. Now it was his turn. And yet, despite everything, this was the loneliest I had ever felt. There were moments, small, treacherous moments, when doubt crept in, when I lay awake at night, staring into the dark, wondering if I was overreacting, if I was tearing apart a marriage over words, over jokes. I thought about the version of myself who would have stayed, the woman who would have apologized just to restore peace, the woman who would have convinced herself that being loved meant being quiet. She still whispered to me sometimes, "What if you're wrong? What if this is as good as it gets?" The weight of those questions pressed down on me hardest when I was alone. Cameron tried once more, really tried. He sat across from me at the kitchen table, eyes tired, voice lower than I'd ever heard it. "I never thought you'd actually leave," he said. There it was, not remorse. Surprise. I realized then that I had never been valued for who I was, only for how predictable I'd been. That night, I stood in the shower longer than necessary, letting the water run hot, watching steam fog the mirror, until I couldn't see myself at all. It felt symbolic. For years, I had let my reflection blur, my needs fade into background noise. Now standing there alone, I felt exposed. Empty. This was the cost of change. There were no cheers, no instant relief, no triumphant music swelling in the background. Just grief. Grief for the years I'd spent trying to be enough for someone who never saw me as equal. Grief for the woman I'd been before I learned how to shrink. Grief for the future I'd imagined that would never exist. One night, I sat on the edge of the bed and realized something terrifying. I wasn't angry anymore. I was numb. That was the true bottom. Not rage, not heartbreak, but the absence of feeling. The moment when love finally runs out, leaving behind nothing but clarity. And in that clarity, I understood something I couldn't unsee. Staying would break me. Leaving already had, but in a way that could still heal. The clarity didn't come all at once. It arrived quietly, the way truth often does, without drama, without shouting, without anyone else in the room to witness it. One morning, I stood in front of the mirror and barely recognized the woman staring back at me. Not because I looked worse, but because I looked awake. My shoulders were straighter, my eyes steadier. There was no apology in my posture anymore. I realized then that nothing Cameron could say, or refuse to say, was going to change what had already shifted inside me. The proof wasn't hidden in text messages or secret confessions. It was in his patterns, his silences, his sudden fear of losing control. He hadn't changed because he understood my pain. He changed because he felt my absence. That realization was painful and freeing. Later that day, we sat across from each other in the living room. The space between us felt vast, despite the small room. "I don't hate you," I said, "but I can't live like this anymore." He rubbed his hands together, searching for words. "So that's it?" "Yes." He stared at the floor. "You're really doing this?" I nodded. I should have done it a long time ago. For the first time, he didn't argue, didn't joke, didn't minimize. He just looked small, and I felt no satisfaction in that, only resolve. That night, I looked up apartments, signed a lease 2 weeks later, nothing fancy, nothing impressive, but it was mine. The night before I left, Cameron stood in the bedroom doorway watching me pack. "I never thought it would end like this," he said. "Neither did I replied. I picked up my bag, walked past him, and didn't look back. Not because it didn't hurt, but because I finally knew my worth. I didn't announce my departure. I didn't post anything, didn't explain myself to friends, didn't ask anyone to take sides. I simply left. And somehow, that silence spoke louder than any confrontation ever could. The apartment was small, 1 bedroom, plain walls, a kitchen that echoed when I set my keys down. But the quiet there felt different. It wasn't heavy, it wasn't tense. It was mine. Meanwhile, Cameron unraveled in ways he never expected. Without me smoothing over conversations, without me absorbing the awkwardness, his jokes landed differently. Harriet still laughed, but others didn't follow as easily. Adam stopped defending him altogether. The absence of my laughter changed the room. People started noticing things they'd ignored before. The sharpness in his tone, the way humor always seemed to cut in one direction, the way he talked about me now that I wasn't there to soften it. And that's when the questions began. Not accusations, just quiet distance. Invitations slowed, conversations shifted. Cameron started realizing that I hadn't been the problem. I had been the buffer. His family felt it too. Adam reached out once, not to interrogate me, not to persuade me, but to say quietly, "I get it now." I didn't respond with bitterness. I didn't need to. Cameron tried reaching out a few times, messages that hovered between regret and defensiveness. I didn't mean it like that. You know how I joke. We could have worked on this. But those messages came too late, and more importantly, they came without understanding. He still framed it as a misunderstanding. I knew better. The real consequence wasn't loneliness. It was reflection. And reflection was something Cameron had never learned to sit with. I heard through others that he seemed quieter now, less certain, that his confidence no longer filled the room the way it used to. Because confidence without someone to stand on is fragile. And I had stepped away. Healing didn't arrive all at once. It came quietly, on mornings when I woke up without bracing myself for someone else's mood. On evenings when silence felt like peace instead of punishment. On days when I realized I hadn't replayed his words in my head even once. In my new apartment, I learned how little I actually needed to feel whole. A clean table, an open window, a mirror that reflected a woman who didn't apologize for existing. I stopped shrinking. Not dramatically, not defiantly, just steadily. Looking back now, I don't see my marriage as a failure. I see it as a lesson I stayed in too long. I learned that love without respect will slowly hollow you out. That jokes meant to entertain others at your expense are not harmless. That being easygoing should never require erasing yourself. I also learned something harder. Sometimes the bravest thing a woman can do isn't fighting louder. It's leaving quietly. Cameron didn't lose me because of one comment at Thanksgiving. He lost me because he never listened when I told him who I was becoming. And I didn't leave because I hated him. I left because I finally loved myself more than I loved the version of me he was comfortable with. If you're listening to this and something feels familiar, if you've ever laughed along while your chest tightened, ever told yourself it wasn't worth speaking up, know this. You are not too sensitive. You are not asking for too much. You are asking the wrong person. And sometimes choosing yourself isn't selfish. It's survival.